I apologize. We're having some audio problems. The broadcast will begin in just a second.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this webinar entitled Don't Stress Out About Pension Stress Testing. Thank you for your patience as we were getting our technical slide issue worked out. My name is Anna Petrini, and I'm a policy specialist in the Labor, Employment, and Retirement Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'll be serving as the moderator of today's webinar. If you'll go to the next slide, please. As a reminder, for best results with the audio portion of this event, we encourage you to use the unique telephone dial-in information contained in the registration email you received. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trusts to bring this webinar to you. In case you're not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. State retirement issues fall primarily within the jurisdiction of one NCSL standing committee, the Committee on Budgets and Revenue. NCSL standing committees allow legislators and legislative staff to exchange state experiences in shaping public policy and managing the legislative institution. They meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Next slide, please. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to learn about how stress testing can help policymakers understand, manage, and plan for risk and cost uncertainty in providing and funding pension benefits. As more and more states adopt legislation mandating stress testing for public pension systems, you may be wondering, what is a stress test, and should my state be conducting one? We'll hear from an expert at the Pew Charitable Trusts as he explains the basics of stress testing, including how it can be used to evaluate the potential impact of the next economic downturn on your state's public retirement system and budget. We'll also learn from a state legislator from South Carolina and senior staff with Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office about how their states are using stress testing in conversations around policy reform. After we hear from our presenters, we'll open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box on the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We'll take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Next slide, please. Our first speaker today, Greg Menace, directs Pew's work on public sector retirement systems. The project provides cutting-edge research on pension and retiree health promises and helps states and cities undertake evidence-based pension and retiree health care reforms. Before joining Pew, he was Assistant Secretary for Fiscal Policy in the Massachusetts Executive Office for Administration and Finance. He also has 15 years of experience in corporate finance and strategy, having served in a variety of roles at Citigroup, JP Morgan, and a market-leading provider of retirement services technology. Mr. Menace is a chartered financial analyst. He has a bachelor's degree in finance and public communications from Syracuse University and a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Next slide, please. Our next speaker is Mark Ryan, the Deputy Director of Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office. The IFO is a nonpartisan agency that provides revenue projections for use in the state budget process, along with impartial and timely analysis of fiscal, economic, and budgetary issues to assist Commonwealth residents and the General Assembly in their evaluation of policy decisions. Prior to joining the IFO in 2011, he served as Executive Director of the Finance Committees for the Pennsylvania Senate and the House of Representatives, and as a forecasting supervisor in the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue's Bureau of Research. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the State University of New York and a Master's of Science in Public Policy and Management from Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University. Next slide, please. As our final speaker, we welcome Senator Bennett of South Carolina. First elected in 2012, Senator Bennett represents the greater Somerville area. He serves on the Senate Finance, Transportation, Banking and Insurance, and Labor, Commerce, and Industry Standing Committees, as well as the Special Joint Committee on Pensions, Department of Commerce Oversight Committee, and is chairman of the Department of Employment and Workforce Oversight Committee. Senator Bennett also serves as president and CEO of Asset Integration Consultants, a comprehensive wealth management firm in Somerville, South Carolina. A graduate of the University of South Carolina, he has been providing financial planning and wealth management assistance to individual and business clients since 1993. After completing his coursework at the College of Charleston, he was awarded the Certified Financial Planner designation. He's a native of the South Carolina Low Country and is a veteran of the South Carolina Army National Guard. So we look forward to hearing from each of our distinguished speakers. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn the program over to Greg Menace at the Pew Charitable Trust. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks very much for having us. Thank you, Anna, everyone at NCSL, the staff at Pew for organizing this event. Thanks for everyone who's joining us today leading into Memorial Day weekend, and special thanks to Senator Bennett and Mark Ryan for joining us today. The topic of our presentation today is based on a report we published this week online at Harvard Kennedy School entitled Assessing the Risk of Fiscal Distress for Public Pensions State Stress Test Analysis. In my remarks today, I'll provide some background on what motivated this research, the methodology that we propose on stress testing, and the findings for those 10 states that were included in our report. What our research shows is that after 9 years of economic recovery and stock market gains, public retirement systems are more vulnerable than they have ever been to the next economic downturn. As a result, state officials need tools to better understand how pension balance sheets and state budgets will be affected by the next recession. Our methodology proposes comprehensive stress testing that combines existing actuarial projections with state-level economic forecasts to better assess these issues. And although our paper is an academic one in nature, this is not an academic exercise. Stress test analysis prompted and shaped needed reforms in Colorado just this past month and was central to the work that was done in Pennsylvania last year. Next slide, please. And in addition to that, we see this as a key emerging trend in the field. Since last spring, 5 states have now adopted stress test legislation: Virginia, Hawaii, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Colorado. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to start with some of the basics on stress testing, and then we'll get into the reasons why we think it's important, and then dig deep into our methodology and the findings from our paper. Stress testing is a simulation technique that is used to evaluate the impact of adverse economic conditions on financial balance sheets. In 2014, the Society of Actuaries Blue Ribbon Panel included a recommendation that public pension plans adopt stress testing as one of the central results of that study. And there's precedent for this. In practice today, the Federal Reserve Bank requires stress testing as part of the Dodd-Frank bill to manage bank financial institutions and their ability to weather economic downturns. Next slide, please. As it applies to public pensions, stress testing helps policymakers to assess the impact of market downturns on pension costs and liabilities, including the likelihood of retirement system insolvency. It examines the effects of financial market volatility and contribution policies on state and municipal budgets, and our recommendations are closely aligned with existing reporting practices, as well as emerging actuarial standards on risk reporting. Next slide, please. This next slide just shows a sample sensitivity analysis of how pension contributions for a sample state, if we could go to the animation, that would be great, could perform under different economic conditions. The blue line shows the expected contributions at an average 7% return assumption. The other 2 lines show how contributions might be higher or lower under state policy. For many of us, this is a very familiar slide that both introduces the concept, but is really only the starting point for doing comprehensive stress test analysis. Next slide, please. Why does it matter? Ultimately, all these studies need to come down to practical application for legislators and policymakers. We see value in 3 ways. It is a comprehensive tool to aid administrators in planning for the next downturn. It can help to promote good funding practices, which over the long term can also save money for government budgets. And it also provides a scorecard to assess reform proposals, as Mark Ryan will talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please. What gets measured gets managed. And now I'd like to shift our focus a little bit to the statement I made before that the pension systems are more vulnerable than they've ever been. This first slide is from Pew's latest funding gap report. It shows the growing trend in the gap between pension assets and pension liabilities. If we go to the next slide, I think a more interesting way to take that information is to examine the total reported unfunded liabilities for public pensions as a percentage of the overall economy measured by US GDP. This chart shows that trend line in the ratio of pension debt to GDP dating all the way back to the 1960s. What is most interesting on the right-hand side of the page is that there are 2 sequential upward spikes, the first in 01-02 around the time of the dot-com downturn, and then again in 2007 and 8 as the Great Recession took hold. And what we find especially concerning is that in each of those cases, the ratio of pension debt to the overall economy stabilized, but in neither case did it return down to previous levels. So now the state level of pension debt is higher than it's ever been since any time before the Great Recession. Next slide, please. Of course, these pension deficits matter because growing unfunded liabilities require more each year from government budgets. And over the past 15 years, what we have seen is that budget costs, on average, have doubled. And what's also concerning about that is despite those large contribution increases, we see the trend of growing unfunded liabilities shown in the prior slide. Next slide, please. As we look forward, the biggest concern is around financial market risk and investment return volatility. This starts with a long-term historical trend, which shows the steady shift away from safer investments like bonds towards riskier investments like stocks and alternative investments. Next slide, please. Which from a financial market risk translates into increasing exposure to the up and down swings of the stock market. What this chart shows is the green line on top, which is the average assumed rate of return for public pension plans across the country, which has declined very little from a little over 8% in 1992 to about 7.4% today. And it compares that to the risk-free rate return on treasury bonds, which is the declining orange line. And the result is this increasing level of investment risk, the equity risk premium, we call it in this case, as shown by the rising blue line. So here again, but based on this metric, systems are more exposed than they've ever been to financial market volatility. Next slide, please. And what we see in this next chart is that translate in, if you could go back to the prior chart, please. What we see in this next chart is that translates into pension fund portfolios that track very closely to the up and down swings of the stock market. The blue line represents the average pension fund return dating back to 2006 based on Tuck's federal state data. The red line is the S&P 500. And as you can see, pension fund returns now close very closely with stock market returns. And finally, on the next slide, if we look at the impact of demographics on cash flow pressure with public pensions, the increasing number of retirees as the baby boomers have moved into retirement has resulted in a widening gap between the benefit outflows, as shown in the blue line going across this page, and the contributions, the inflows coming into the system. So taking all these pieces together, what we see again is that despite 9 years of economic growth, pension systems, by all leading indicators, are more vulnerable than they've ever been to the next downturn. Now I'd like to shift towards the details of the methodology that we propose in the paper. There are two components to that methodology. The first is a standard simulation model foundation structure. It includes inputs ranging from actuarial projections to state revenue forecasts, the simulator itself, as well as outputs that look at a variety of fiscal metrics. And what these arrows point to are some of the features of the methodology we're proposing that go beyond what pension systems are reporting on today. So for example, on the left-hand side of the page in the inputs, our model not only builds on actuarial projections and looks at different investment return scenarios, but also incorporates a state-specific outlook for economic growth and revenue in order to assess budget impacts. Next slide, please. Equally as important is the analytic framework. Simulation models like these can run literally endless scenarios, and as a result, it's essential to have a point of view on exactly which scenarios and assumptions one is going to measure. We essentially look at a range of economic scenarios that assume, for example, a fixed 5% return over a period of time, and then in addition to that, a set of behavioral assumptions that overlay a range of potential actions by policymakers in terms of making full contributions in the face of economic recessions. Next slide, please. And on these next 3 slides, I'm just going to go through very quickly some of the details of our methodology. What this shows is a distribution of returns based on our own capital market assumptions with a 6.4% expected rate over 20 years. That is very much in line with what most experts are forecasting. Next slide, please. This next slide shows how we developed our revenue projections across the state. What each of the line represents is the correlation between gross state product for each of the 10 states in our study and how that has moved with revenue growth over time. Essentially what this does is provide us a very simple reference point and correlation to point to when projecting state revenue on a state-by-state basis. Next slide, please. And finally, just to give some context to our model of behavior on contribution policy, one of the important findings of our research is that, for the most part, in response to economic downturns, states have not been able to afford to stick with their existing state policies, but rather have adjusted amortization schedules. And That behavior is factored into the projections that we use. Next slide, please. State stress testing in practice. Here we'll focus on the results of our 10 state findings. Next slide, please. And we start out with three important questions from a research perspective. Number one, how do we measure fiscal distress and which states are at risk? Secondly, what is the impact of lower investment returns expected to be on state budgets over time? And last, how does financial market volatility affect state pension plans and state budgets based on existing policies? Next slide, please. What this next slide shows is a 50-state snapshot of two important financial ratios. The bars going from left to right show the funded ratios for each of the 50 states, consistent with our research, and the dots that go across the page show the ratio of negative operating cash flow to assets. The details of that calculation are included in the paper, but what it essentially provides is an indicator of fiscal distress. And high negative rates of operating cash flow mean it's very likely that if investments underperform, assets will begin to dwindle and potentially lead to insolvency. We've called out three states, Colorado, Kentucky, and New Jersey on this page, because based on our research, those three are the most exposed to insolvency, as demonstrated by the stress test analysis. Next slide, please. Overall, we looked at 10 states closely in the study. We cut them across 5 different categories, ranging from New Jersey and Kentucky. Those states we see at the highest risk of retirement system insolvency. And then on the other end of the spectrum, North Carolina and Wisconsin. I think it's important to also draw attention to those well-funded states, both because in the case of Wisconsin, they can provide examples and models of states and systems that have already put policies in place to manage financial market volatility. And the case in North Carolina, a state that has always paid its bills, it may point to opportunities for further improvement in already strong funding policies. Next slide, please. To provide some of the highlights on select states, we'll start with the state of New Jersey. What this chart shows is the market value of assets. Those are the blue bars that are dwindling rapidly in this particular scenario. And then the operating cash flow measure, which I mentioned briefly before. What's interesting about this is the particular scenario we chose is not an unreasonable expected outcome. We assume 5% market returns over 20 years, certainly lower than expectations, but something that experts believe have a 1 in 4 chance of happening. And we also assume that the state only continues to make contributions at the current share of budget. Under those conditions, we see the high risk of insolvency. To be fair, New Jersey has adopted a policy to address this issue, but that will require tripling contributions over 5 years, something of concern given the state's track record in that regard. Next slide, please. Separately, states like Pennsylvania and Connecticut, although they also rank in the bottom 5 from an overall funding perspective, have essentially taken their medicine over the past decade in terms of rapidly raising contributions and also adopting hybrid plan models. So what this slide shows to start, though, is that in both cases, those increasing contributions, here measured as a percentage of payroll, now consume a substantial part of state budgets, between 10 and 15% in these two cases. And if you turn to the next slide, where we look specifically at Connecticut, what we see is in a downturn scenario, as represented by the blue line, the state policy that the policymakers are currently held to would require spikes in contributions that we think would ultimately prove to be unaffordable. As a result, stress testing can help states like Connecticut and Pennsylvania, who are not at risk of insolvency, but do face a challenge of potentially permanent high fixed cost, to plan for those issues better going forward. Next slide, please. Another example is the state of Colorado. I mentioned earlier that a state stress test analysis helped to shape and prompt reforms. The information included on this follows the same scenario we looked at for New Jersey. And although the decline in asset levels and the accelerating negative cash flow ratio are much less dramatic, what it shows is that immediately the state would be at risk of insolvency in terms of dwindling assets. And over a 30-year period, both state officials and Pew's analysis pointed to about a 1 in 4 chance of the system going bankrupt without reforms. Those reforms, as I said before, not included in this analysis, were designed specifically to address this issue. Next slide, please. Stress testing also allows us to think about the effectiveness of policies in well-funded states like North Carolina and Wisconsin. I think what we find interesting here is that while North Carolina has a terrific track record of paying its bills every year, its funding policy is very rigid. And if there are downturns in the economy or lower than expected returns, we could see expected pension costs nearly double. It's possible that that may not be affordable for the state budget, and as a result, stress testing helps a state like North Carolina look for opportunities for improvement in shaping their funding policy. And as I said before, Wisconsin, which also pays its bills on time every year, but also has a unique risk-managed DB plan, forecast to perform extremely well in terms of stable costs under a variety of economic scenarios. Next slide, please. With the benefit of Senator Bennett on the phone, we also included some information here on South Carolina. This is a somewhat more dramatic scenario, what we call an asset shock scenario. It's based on the Dodd-Frank stress test applied to banks. It assumes there's a big drop in the stock market and then lower economic growth going forward. In this particular scenario, we see that there are concerns that lay ahead for South Carolina. Just to provide some general context, in some of the other scenarios, recent reforms that the state passed, including improving its governance and raising funding, actually have the effect of preventing some of these negative outcomes that we see on this chart. But if we take the analysis one step further and look at this asset shock scenario, it suggests there's more work left to be done, and South Carolina has done a terrific job over the past year of advancing reforms, and this would suggest that there's more work here. Next slide, please. So in summary, U.S. public funds face unprecedented exposure to financial market volatility and downturns. The findings of our research point both to poorly funded plans needing policies in place to prevent the risk of actual pension fund insolvency, an event that would raise annual costs by billions of dollars. At the same time, we can look at the well-funded states and learn lessons on how best to protect against fiscal distress. Ultimately, stress test analysis will help states prepare for economic uncertainty, improve existing policies, and evaluate reforms. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Greg. As a reminder, after we hear from all of our presenters, we're going to open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask a question, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box on the right-hand corner of your screen. And now over to you, Mark. Next slide. Mark?
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and present a Pennsylvania perspective and describe our recent experience with stress testing. As much of the background of my office was described in my introduction, I'll forego any further discussion of that, and just because it'll be familiar to most listeners who are familiar with the legislative fiscal offices and their operations. Perhaps just a couple of quick notes on some unique characteristics of our office. It is an independent agency and doesn't report to a legislative body or commission. And it's a relatively recent creation, beginning operations only 7 years ago. Next slide, please. Pension analysis was not one of the original duties when the IFO was created. That responsibility was added in 2016, but it really continued a long-standing requirement in Pennsylvania law that pension legislation receive an actuarial note prior to consideration. With the assignment of the duties to the IFO, the actuarial note process was changed to no longer require the approval of a commission of executive and legislative branch appointees. However, a key provision in the statute transferring those duties was the requirement that a risk transfer analysis be performed when analyzing legislation that makes substantial pension benefit changes. And this risk transfer analysis is the vehicle for the stress testing that is currently being performed in Pennsylvania. A few relevant process-related notes before we get into the substance of the IFO's work. The office contracts with actuaries to provide an evaluation and analysis regarding the effects of proposed legislation. We don't employ any actuaries actually on staff, and we do perform some supplemental analysis that is based on data received from our actuaries and from actuaries in the pension systems. If you could move on to the next set of bullet points, thank you. The risk transfer analysis that I mentioned earlier quantifies the shift in investment risk from the employer's perspective, and the risk is shifted to the employee. And in our work, we employed one of the stress testing techniques that's described in the Pew paper, sensitivity analysis, to implement our risk transfer analysis ourselves. More details on that to come, but much of that was motivated by the time frame inherent in addressing the legislative process and analyzing a proposal within the constraints of the legislative process. Now, while we used a sensitivity analysis as our approach, that's not the only approach that could be used. A stochastic analysis, which would be more robust, is being examined in the future and would represent a more comprehensive way to look at it. Next slide, please. Very soon after the office had received its actuarial analysis duties, it was required to analyze legislation that would make major benefit design changes for new hires beginning in 2019. And I won't get into the details of the proposal other than to say that it was a fairly comprehensive proposal, and it was implemented going forward, so it had no impact on current employees. In the next group, yes, thank you. As previously noted, we used the sensitivity analysis, and specifically, we examined the impact of a 1 percentage point reduction in the assumed rate of return for the entire 30-year projection period. The analysis quantified the impact of the change on employer contributions under current law and also under the proposed legislation. Changing the assumed rate slightly more conservative approach than assuming the actual returns fall 1 percentage point below the assumed rate, because in this situation, the employer contributions respond more quickly to that assumption. And just as a technical note, the analysis didn't assess the affordability factor and assumed that the employer contributions would be made based on the current law or funding policy. Next slide, please. The IFO established the overall approach for the analysis, which was, as I mentioned before, somewhat constrained by the time and resources available. And taking place in the context of the legislative process, those constraints are particularly relevant. However, the analysis had two real components. We looked at all employees, current pension system members, and new members affected by the proposal. And the data for these computations were obtained exclusively from the system actuaries. And the office worked closely with our actuaries and the pension system actuaries to complete all of this work. Now, because of the interest in the impact on new employees and the design of the proposal to affect only new hires, we did a separate analysis that zeroed in on the impact for those employees. And those computations were based on specific data, such as employer normal costs that were obtained from actuaries. And we worked closely with the actuaries from all of the systems and our own actuaries to make reasonable data requests that could comply with the various time and financial constraints that we had. It was really a joint effort, and it was a workable situation, workable approach to the situation that we face, and one that could be done in other places. We're not pension experts, and we're able to work with the experts to produce the analysis that was required. We only looked at one. If you could look at go to the next group. Okay. We only really looked at one alternate return assumption, the 1 percentage point reduction in the assumed rate. However, a broader analysis could be performed with multiple earnings assumptions, and Greg talked about this in some length. The stochastic analysis could also help establish distribution of outcome and the probabilities of those outcomes, and that's something that we think could be done, and we are looking to improve our capabilities on that regard. The next set of slides, please. Moving into the results of what we found and our experience, I just note that one aspect of our analysis that has generally been overlooked is the current law effect of a 1 percentage point reduction in the assumed rate of return. And that component of our analysis closely aligns with the stress testing discussed by Greg in his portion of the presentation. We found that the current law impact of reducing the rate would be about $49 billion in higher employer contributions over a 30-year projection period. And I would note that this assumes that the additional employer contributions are made according to the current policy. If we relax that assumption and looked at a affordability measure, the rates would stay high, but they wouldn't go high enough to meet the actuarially required contributions, and the funding ratio would therefore decline. Next group of bullets, please. Most of the attention in our analysis has been on the projected impact of the legislation, which is now statute. And the analysis did show that the new benefit design, which moved employees, gave the employees the option of different plans that would include hybrid plans and pure defined contribution plans. It ultimately makes the employer contributions less sensitive to reductions in the rate of return. However, because the changes apply only to new hires, that effect shows up only very slowly over a period of time. Early in the initial years of enactment, you don't see too much of an effect. However, when you focus only on new employees, and there is substantial interest among policymakers on focusing on those employees, we found that more than 50% of the higher contributions that would be associated with a lower rate of return could be mitigated under that scenario. And that finding really confirmed what the advocates for the legislation had intended, that it reduces the sensitivity to a drop in earnings, and that that reduction in sensitivity was fairly significant for new employees, the ones that were affected by the proposal. Next slide, please. Just as a concluding note, I would say that in analyzing doing the stress testing in the context of a legislative proposal provides a number of constraints. There are fewer constraints when the stress testing is built into a regular schedule and done as a matter of course, and not tied to the dictates of the legislative calendar. Our finding was that stress testing is revealing, and it does show the sensitivity of pension funding to the rates of return. And we appreciate the opportunity that NCSL has extended to us to talk about our experience, and we'll turn it over to Senator Bennett.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now over to you, Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate that. Appreciate you having me and inviting me to participate in this call today. I will start off just quickly with a bit of an apology. I thought I was doing everyone a favor by not subjecting you to a number of more slides to go through, but had I known that the alternative would have been sitting here looking at my face on your screen for the remainder of the conversation here, I probably should have sent a few slides in to break up the monotony, so I apologize for that. I'm I'm just going to touch briefly on a few of the things that we're dealing with here in South Carolina, what we have done and what we're not doing with respect to the stress test conversation that we've been having here today. As Greg pointed out earlier in his presentation, South Carolina did do quite a bit of reforms to our system, not this past legislative year that we just concluded, but the previous legislative year. And most of those were with respect to the funding of our system, shoring up the system, making some fairly significant governance changes, but not really moving beyond that to stress test requirements or plan design changes or things of that. Those things are coming in phase 2. We had actually hoped to have done some of that this past legislative year, but we got bogged down in a couple of fairly significant and urgent issues that really sucked the air and the oxygen out of the room and prevented us from getting there, but we hope to do that. What we are doing as far as stress test goes, though, while not statutorily dictated, our investment commission does do stress tests on a fairly regular basis. They do that, however, more on the portfolio level than anything else. They do work with our public employee benefits group to do some more actuarially active modeling, but not to the extent I think that we need to down here. I completely agree that the stress testing mechanisms that are put in place and they're advocated by Pew and others, the primary function of that, or the primary advantage that I see from a policymaker myself, is that it will help and to describe to a number of members, the majority of our members in the General Assembly, who really just don't have, it's not that they don't have expertise and knowledge, they just don't have an expertise and knowledge in the complexity of pension plans. While we all know that there are very few variables that go into ultimately getting to a decision about the validity of a pension system or not, getting to those variables and understanding those variables and what the outcomes are very difficult to visualize for most members. And I think that's the most powerful benefit to the tools that we're advocating for under the stress test mechanism. So internally at our investment commission, they're doing those numbers. They're running those stress tests annually. They are not what I like to call, mainly because it's much more easy to say, Monte Carlo type of analysis with forward-thinking motions. They're doing that more often. They're trying to bring that component into the system, but certainly annually those more static stress tests, and then introducing the Monte Carlo styles later on. They're also using multiple providers for that, so it's not the same groups that are constantly doing the stress tests. We're bringing in independent folks to take a look at those things. Those are the types of background and pulling the curtain away that I think again helps our members to better understand what the overall objectives are. As many of you know, for instance, our pension system, depending on the day and who you ask, is underfunded anywhere between $19 to $21 billion. I believe that number is probably more accurately closer to $40 billion, simply because of the higher expected rate of return that we use, which, by the way, up until the reforms were completely dictated by the General Assembly, setting a static number. We're now moving that out over the next few years to have the Investment Commission and the Public Employee Benefit Group to make those determinations based on a lot of these tests that are ultimately going to be run, so that we get a better, more accurate number to use in our projections. Those types of things are helpful. It's easy for those things to be politicized. you know, we went through that over the past few years. South Carolina was kind of late to the game to begin with, to get into the equity markets for our pension system. And as you might expect, when we did get into the game, it was at the wrong point and the wrong time. So it's very easy for politicians to make political hay out of those things and argue about rates of return and investment allocations and those sorts of things. And we get that almost on a daily basis. So to have these sorts of tools that we're talking about today to provide some background and some understanding for the members that are willing to put the time in to come up with effective policy, to recognize risks to that policy, it is so helpful. And I think that our members are gonna realize that more and more as we walk farther down the road. So, you know, with that said, that's a little background on where we are. I think where we're headed, what I believe we need to be looking at every day. I'll turn it back over, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Senator. At this time, we're happy to take questions from the audience. Again, to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. And as these are coming in, I've got one here. Let's begin with Greg, and then if the other speakers want to chime in, that's great. Can you talk a little bit more about the cost of this type of analysis?
No, I think that's a great question, and we are certainly advocating a methodology that accounts for government-strained budgets. I think specifically having an approach that builds on existing actuarial projections, uses the plan's own assumptions, and leverages other analysis that they may be doing on investment variability, as Senator Bennett described, is the right starting point to provide a substantial number of the inputs to the analysis. And then I think beyond that, a way to manage cost is to have a preset number of scenarios that are specifically designed to answer questions on impacts to state budgets. That extra piece is something that needs to go outside of the pension system simply because they're not mandated with responsibility for forecasting tax revenue, but it's a fairly straightforward thing to document. So long story short, I think by building on actuarial projections, by ensuring there's a set of analyses that are pre-designed in the way that we're proposing to answer specific questions, not just for the pension system board members, but really more so for state budget officials, I think those are the way to manage costs. Certainly there's some incremental effort that goes into that. But I think it's one of those things that could certainly be done in a robust manner for something less than 6 figures. I know that there was one quote in one of the states we worked in where what they were really interested in doing came back with something, somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. I'm not sure that that's the right level of resource to get the right output, but I think it's fair to say that this is not at all cost prohibitive. And by having a standardized approach that we think all states should adopt, by building on the existing numbers, but also incorporating the state's own perspective on their economy, this is something that could be done to both answer questions and be cost efficient.
And this is Mark speaking. And I think the answer to that question could be really dependent upon who does the work. To the extent that one can build upon existing work that's done by the actuaries for the pension system, some of which they've already done, but there would be an extension for the stress testing. The cost could be mitigated if one had to create new models separately and project from there. The cost could be higher, but to the extent that you can build upon existing resources and actuarial work, that could help minimize or mitigate the cost.
Great, thank you very much. And our next question is, what is the intended audience for stress tests? Is there a dissemination plan and or a way for interested parties to access the test?
I'll jump in on that if I may. I think there are kind of two audiences in my opinion. There's in our in our experience or in our world that we operate in, because our investment commission is already doing much of that stress testing, the audience is to their internal staff and their board to understand what their current portfolios are doing and what the allocation they should expect, and so on and so forth. Those folks understand. They understand the weeds parts of that work and the details and the data behind that. The other side is what I alluded to, are the policymakers that don't need to get into those weeds, but do need the larger, broader views of what we can expect moving forward by tweaking and making changes. And I think that's where the real value comes for the folks that aren't already using that, the policymakers inside, to help drive the discussions. Again, I alluded to it before, everything can get politicized. Pension reform and shoring up pensions is really, at the end of the day, a math problem. And if we can help, if these stress tests can be boiled down to a concise way to convey to the policy makers the overall vision and what different changes can be expected, I think it helps us to focus on the math problem and not on the political problem.
Thank you very much, Senator. Let's see, another question here. Aren't retirement plans already required to do much of this type of analysis? Let's go to Greg.
No. I think the short answer is really no. I think what retirement plans are required to do involves reporting as part of financial state reports under GASB requirements. There's both a fiduciary duty and an industry standard to provide certain reports that relate to actuarial valuations and experience studies. And as we've said before, every system that I'm aware of does some version of analyses around a range of investment returns, typically as part of an asset liability management study. But there is no current requirement for them to, there's no current requirement for the state to provide something along the lines of what we're proposing, which again, I think integrates those types of analyses with the outlook for the state budget and economy. I think the good news is there is an emerging and new standard, ASB 51, that just came out late last year. It's under the umbrella of risk reporting, but it identifies essentially the same risks that all of us have been talking about today. And it recommends that actuaries perform these certain types of analyses as a regular practice going forward. So as a matter of course, there has not been a hard requirement, nor apart really from the state of Washington and to some degree California, have states regularly produced the analysis that is comprehensive in the way that we've described. But there's absolutely been progress in terms of the Actuarial Standards Board now laying down the groundwork for those professionals to do the important part of this analysis. But one more time, I think what we're proposing would incorporate all those good ideas, but also take it a step further to provide the information Senator Bennett described that is also geared towards state budget officials.
Thanks very much, Greg. Would you please remind our audience about how they can access your current report?
Sure, there's a link for the Harvard Kennedy School website. Sarah, do you want to make sure everyone gets that information or touch on that now?
Absolutely. We'll be sure to circulate the link to all attendees.
Great. All right. I think that's all the questions we've got time for. If you have any questions following the event, please feel free to contact us at the email addresses shown on the next slide. Just a quick note, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. You can find additional resources on the Pew and NCSL websites and additional materials in the appendix section of the slide deck. That'll be available shortly on the NCSL site. One final note, NCSL and Pew will also be putting on an issue forum session at this year's Legislative Summit in LA. This will take place on 2 p.m. on Wednesday, August 1st, and it will focus on stress testing and economic swings. Last slide, please. Lastly, please take a moment to share your feedback on this webinar by taking a short survey after it concludes. Thank you all so much for your interest and participation today.
Thanks, Anna.